Context of PTSD Throughout History by Alex Cody. War never changes. Aside from being a very cool tagline from an overrated video game, it perhaps can be an insight into the history of conflicts and the effects they have on the human psyche. From depression to hallucinations to survivor's guilt, war leaves scars on the mind as well as the body. The evolution of how society views the results of war can be viewed in a retrospective lens, as the evolution of psychology and science itself. If one were to ask Sun Tzu, an ancient Chinese philosopher of war, he would say, "Those who win every battle are not really skillful. Those who render others' armies helpless without fighting are the best of all." In The Art of War, Sun Tzu goes through his philosophies on how to win a war quickly with as little death as possible. Before he became a philosopher, Sun Tzu was a soldier himself, so it is possible that he himself was trying to help others avoid the horrors of war to the best of his ability. How these horrors were known in the years past have changed, from exhaustion to shell-shocked to what we now know as PTSD. As the way society understands the effect of war on the mind grows, how it treats those who come out of it changes. According to the DSM-5, or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, the authority in psychology and various disorders of the mind, diagnostic criteria for PTSD includes a history of exposure to a traumatic event that meets specific stipulations and symptoms from each of the 4 symptom clusters: intrusion, avoidance, negative alterations in cognition and mood, and alterations in arousal and reactivity. The 6th criterion concerns duration of symptoms, the 7th assessing functioning, and the 8th criterion classifying the symptoms as not attributed to a substance or co-occurring medical condition, from Brainline Military. Besides being a very lengthy definition, it perhaps provides some insight as to why PTSD is so prevalent in war. But if this is true, then why would people have PTSD pretty much since wars began, likely shortly after groups of humans began congregating together? Then why has it taken till fairly recently for society to come to terms with what is happening? In all honesty, is more of a problem of knowledge than anything else. Even going more than 200 years back, the first discussion of trauma related to nervous disorders on the battlefield began in the late 1800s. During this time, military doctors had begun to diagnose soldiers with exhaustion following the stress of battle. This exhaustion was often characterized by mental shutdowns as a result of trauma. Unable to treat the ambiguous disorders, physicians resorted to the mere prescription of rest. Supposed to possess the strength necessary to stave off fear, or at least to hide it, soldiers were treated with 3 hots and a cot before being sent back to the front lines to continue fighting. At this time, it was not understood as a legitimate illness or disability, but rather physical exhaustion. Chamberlain. Though today this would seem kind of far from a proper medical diagnosis, given the symptoms the soldiers were experiencing, at the time it was likely the best they could do. Knowledge is key, and during that time, knowledge was nowhere near what we have today, much like how our current knowledge will be nowhere near what it will be 200 years from now. A further evolution of exhaustion became popular during and after the First World War. The term shell-shock replaced it and became the term used for the majority of the 20th century. During World War I and following it, the term became extremely popular, referring to the feeling soldiers would get after surviving shelling from artillery. However, this feeling would persist long after the shells stopped dropping, and thus became synonymous with feeling not quite right. In terms of the timeline that is being laid out of the history of trauma of war, shell shock is integral in our idea of the First World War, and because of this conflict has been so crucial in forming our idea of understandings of war in general, that means the histories of shell shock have a vital part to play in determining how we, as moderns, orient ourselves towards war, and how in these orientations shape the way we tell ourselves about past and future wars. and what war itself means. Its histories are therefore messy. The concept of trauma contains and generates knotty ethical political problems. Log creme. Wait, politics? When did that begin to matter in the discussion of war and effects? Actually, since the beginning. Nobody wants to be the politician to say negative things about veterans, at least no politician that wants to be elected, anyway. So when the President of the United States, then presidential candidate Donald Trump, came under fire for apparently making fun of veterans who have mental illnesses, there's quite a bit of backpedaling to be done by his campaign. From October 3rd, 2016. When people come back from war and combat, and they see things that maybe a lot of folks in this room may have seen many times over, and you're strong, and you can handle it, but a lot of people, they can't handle it. Trump's campaign team tried to put out that fire, responding with, Mr. Trump was highlighting the challenges that veterans face when returning home after serving their countries. He has always respected the service and sacrifice of our military men and women. Proposing reform to Veterans Affairs adequately address the various issues veterans face when they return home. Ignoring the credibility of the man who said it, Michael Flynn, this is a primary example of how the American political system views trauma and the plight of veterans. Even today, people still want to use trauma as a political tool, rather than seeing the trauma and thinking they should avoid war. But that's a topic for another day. So anyway, the politics of war are a delicate matter, and in this case, they're intertwined with the politics of drama. Trauma. As it stands now, PTSD, which has become the go-to for talking about mental trauma in war, is still a huge issue for soldiers returning from war. Today, hundreds of thousands of servicemen and women, and recent military veterans have seen combat. Many have been shot, seen their buddies killed, or witnessed death up close. These types of events that lead to PTSD, Medline Plus. Recent figures put numbers at 31% of Vietnam veterans, 10% of Gulf War veterans, 11% of Afghan War veterans, and 20% of Iraq War veterans, all having PTSD, Medline Plus. With such obscenely high numbers of veterans coming back home with PTSD, of course politicians have to say something about it. Why? Because they know people care about war. Hell, care about soldiers. Hell, they might even care about soldiers. But politicians will do whatever it takes to garner the support from their constituents. And thus, PTSD has become something of a sideshow now, something that is talked about, but often in context of political life, and hardly ever about how these soldiers can be helped. Even now, after more than 2,000 years of modern human history, it seems, at least in the United States, the species has not evolved past the point of using the suffering of others as a posturing and political tool to benefit those in power. Granted, the knowledge that has been obtained in regard to human health has come leagues and bounds beyond what it was in early years. Maybe war has not changed, but as a species, humans certainly have quite a bit. In years past, countries would go to war with each other without thinking, killing thousands in their wake and leaving citizens and veterans scarred for life, both mentally and physically. Now, although many people are still very hawkish, some of those in power even going so far as to potentially putting the world into a nuclear conflict that would pretty much end it. However, there's a stark change in tone now. Those in power must face the repercussions of the lies of those whose lives they destroy, whether it be negative press, blocked pieces of legislature, or even impeachment should their transgressions be harmful enough. It is very possible that Sun Tzu, with his limited power and influence, was trying to save as many lives of soldiers as possible during his time. Now, hopefully, society can save the lives of soldiers even better than Sun Tzu was, and treat them for the wounds that are invisible, which is something Sun Tzu would have approved of if he was around today. War might never change, but people surely can, so hopefully they can change enough to grow some empathy rather than using suffering as a political tool.